The date is officially set for Texas and Oklahoma's departure from the Big 12 to join the SEC in 2024, and Horns 24/7 has all of the insight into the negotiations that led to an exit agreement being reached. I'm Taylor Estes, joined by Horns 24/7 columnist Chip Brown, who has been a leading reporter throughout the negotiations that the Big 12 and Texas have had. Before their departure, leading to the SEC. So, Chip, let's get right to it. Big 12 announced Thursday night that Texas and Oklahoma will leave the conference officially and join the SEC July 1st, 2024. We've talked a lot about this on the flagship podcast. You've written a lot about this over at horns247.com. There have been a lot of changes, it seems, in the last week. But what has happened in the last week that led to the parties finally reaching an exit agreement?
Yeah, it's been interesting because I think, I know according to Texas officials, they were expecting this agreement to come out on January 30th, the day before the Big 12 released its 2023 football schedule. And we've been talking here on the flagship podcast and in the insider at horns247.com that Texas and OU wanted that exit agreement done before the 2023 football schedule came out. That's why the 2023 Big 12 football schedule was 7 weeks late. But then Fox was sort of the holdup here. Fox and ESPN, the television partners of the Big 12. It's complicated because even though Fox and ESPN are partners in the Big 12 and will continue to be, even in the new media rights agreement that was reached for the new Big 12 starting in 2025, they are adversaries when it comes to ESPN's interest in the SEC and ESPN's desire to get Texas and Oklahoma into the SEC when ESPN's broadcast rights for the SEC began in 2024. So Fox had they wanted to be made whole for the games that they would be missing from Texas and Oklahoma. And they, were able to ask for kind of whatever they wanted. And they asked for a lot. But in the end, Taylor, they're going to get 20 million of the 100 million combined. Texas and Oklahoma are each going to pay $50 million in diluted revenue. They're going to take less revenue in their final year of the Big 12, this coming, 23-24 school year. And then they're going to take less in the first year in the SEC. And that money will be transferred from, ESPN to the conference. Fox will get 20 million of that. And the remaining legacy schools in the Big 12 will get the other 80 million, 10 million per school. And yes, there was a request by Fox, and it proved to be the trigger that finalized the deal for Fox. They wanted Texas's home game against Michigan in 2024 to be played at Michigan in 2024, with the return date in 2027 being played at Texas. The reason for this is by playing it at Michigan, it becomes a Fox broadcast. Fox got the Big Ten media rights deal, and they will have the rights to it, and they sublicensed to NBC and CBS and excluded ESPN. It's the first time ESPN is not going to have any broadcast rights in the Big Ten for decades. And so this was a tough one for ESPN because obviously by having that game at Texas, it's an ESPN game and keeps ESPN with a marquee game involving a Big Ten school. By losing it to Fox, it's a double whammy, and ESPN doesn't really have a marquee Big Ten game in 2024. So it was a big deal, and I have confirmed with officials at Michigan and Texas that this, the contract hasn't been signed yet, but it's going to be done. And so that is what ultimately, kind of sealed the deal. And we got the announcement on Thursday night that Texas and OU will indeed be going to the SEC beginning in 2024.
Yeah, you mentioned the Michigan game kind of being impacted. Looking at the future schedules for out of conference games scheduled for Texas, they have a few coming up, pretty big ones. There's Georgia coming up. There's Ohio State coming up. You obviously the Michigan one is being impacted by this change. Are there any other games that will the non-conference games that will potentially change of future schedules that Texas already has agreed upon?
Not that I know of at this point. Now, you mentioned those future games against Georgia coming up. That will obviously become a conference game, and we'll see, because the SEC, part of the reason this thing needed to come together, typically the drop dead deadline is like May, for scheduling to begin for um, the year after the upcoming football season. In other words, the 2024 scheduling will begin immediately for both the Big 12 and the SEC. And so, that's exciting. The SEC just had meetings within the last 3 weeks. Uh, Texas and Oklahoma were part of those meetings. They're trying to figure out if they're going to go to a 9-game conference schedule with 3 non-conference games. They're obviously, it's looking like they're gonna have divisionless. It's going to be a divisionless conference, and you'll have 3 regular annual opponents, and then they'll rotate the other 6. And that way, you're not going more than 4 years without playing everyone in the league. In the past, it's embarrassing, the way that years would go by. Alabama and Georgia, I think, went, like more than 10 years without playing a regular season game. And so this will change that. And now the SEC can get to work on those schedules. But it was interesting because everyone's like, oh, the Big 12, they were trying to stick it to Texas and OU. The Big 12 signed off on this a while ago. Brett Yormark, the conference commissioner, the legacy schools, they were good with Texas and OU moving on after they got their new media rights deal, which will actually pay them a little more, like at least $2 million per school more, beginning in 2025 after Texas and OU have left. And we know Brett Yormark is also aggressively courting schools in the Pac 12. And the Pac 12 still does not have a media rights agreement. And the Pac 12's talking to SMU and San Diego State about joining their conference. And that's going to be critical for the Pac 12 to add 2 more schools for inventory purposes, because their media rights deal is probably going to have a huge streaming component. And I'm hearing it's going to be a big streaming component for Friday night games in the Pac 12. But, so it's been fascinating. It's a 30 for 30 for sure, with how Fox and ESPN have had to coexist. And in the past, it's been, pretty friendly, pretty cooperative, but it did change after Fox got the Big Ten media rights and sublicensed to NBC and CBS and excluded ESPN. So this was quite an exchange, quite a negotiation session. I had one source tell me I've been, negotiating on this hard for 3 months. It felt like 3 years. So it's done, and Texas and Oklahoma, 100 million combined, 50 million each. It sounds like a lot, but Taylor, remember the bylaws that Texas and OU both voted on in 2012 for everyone agreeing to stay in the league for 99 years calls for 2 years of revenue to be forfeited. Based on what schools were paid this year, a little over 42 million, that would put it at close to 85 million. So getting out for 50 million plus making Fox whole is a pretty good deal. I know that doesn't sound like it, but it's a it's a pretty good deal. Although I think a lot of UT officials they're wondering why on earth UT signed that 99-year agreement back in 2012. But um, it is a 50 million's less than, and certainly less than what it could have been.
Yeah, and I think, Chip reported over at Horns 24/7 that former Big 12 Commissioner Bob Bowlesby was pretty much going scorched earth once Texas and Oklahoma, decided to leave the conference for the SEC when that news dropped in the summer of 2021. And he wanted to get every single dollar of that $85 million exit fee from them. And also, accused ESPN of tampering. I mean, you name it. It was like watching, the first hearing of a divorce hearing, honestly, and it was the angry ex that didn't want the divorce to kind of happen. And so, 50 million sounds like a lot, but it seems like, a good win-win situation, which is what Brett Yormark, as you've reported, has wanted to come to since he took over as a Big 12 conference commissioner. Now, you had said, with the $100 million total, 50 million for each school in forfeited revenue, you explained how that money would be distributed to the Big 12 schools and to Fox. But what does that mean for the Longhorns and Sooners' first year of revenue in the SEC?
Yeah, it's gonna be less. I'm told about $18 million less than what the other schools in the SEC will receive. Now, because of the projections of what the SEC is going to bring in with Texas and Oklahoma in the conference, those projections, the schools were just distributed about $49 million in television revenue. That is expected to go to 60 plus million when Texas and Oklahoma arrive. Um, Texas officials feel like they'll make up the 50 million in year 3 of the SEC. So it's short-term pain for long-term gain. We know Texas has a healthy reserve fund, even with all the facilities expansion Texas has done. They have a healthy reserve fund. They can absorb this. Um, and and so Oklahoma not so much, but Oklahoma is able to handle this. And one of the things that had been proposed, Taylor, was for Texas and OU to each play 4 games against remaining Big 12 schools, the legacy schools. And for OU fans, it might have been a way to keep the Oklahoma State rivalry going. But neither Texas nor Oklahoma really had a desire to commit that many games to the the old Big 12 in their non-conference schedule going forward. So they were able to avoid that, and um, in large part because of that Texas Michigan game flipping to a Michigan home game in 2024.
Well, one thing too, Chip, speaking of kind of the media rights there, I think a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen with Longhorn Network. That deal that Texas had signed with ESPN to form Longhorn Network was a backloaded deal that Texas would get paid more money in the latter years of Longhorn Network since it was launched in 2011. So, what is going to happen to the Longhorn Network?
Yeah, that's a tough one because I've done the math on this, and even after the 23-24 school year, ESPN would have still owed Texas $150 million on that deal. As you mentioned, it truly was backloaded. It started at $5 million per year and graduated every year. So that's a huge chunk of change that will basically, prove to be a savings for ESPN. And even though UT officials are trying to put a positive spin on every softball and baseball game continuing to be aired after Texas moves into the SEC, they're either going to have to add a channel to the SEC network to pull that off, or because Longhorn Network as we know it will go away. So, we'll have to see if we're going to have an SEC Network 1 and an SEC Network 2, kind of like ESPN and ESPN2. But, UT officials are saying you're still going to get all your Longhorn sports that you've become accustomed to. It's just going to be part of the SEC network. So, we'll have more on that as it, becomes clear.
All right, Chip, good stuff there. Anything else that you think is important for people to know about, this change in the college football landscape, honestly, with Texas and OU finally officially joining the SEC?
Well, I know Texas fans are looking at the schedule with that Michigan game going to Ann Arbor in 2024, and they're saying, now, wait a minute, we're at Alabama in 23, we're at Michigan in 24, and we're at Ohio State in 25. Where's our marquee non-conference home game? And part of the reason that you're going to the SEC is because you're going to have a whole slate of better home games than you've had against the Big 12 as we know it right now. So depending on how those schedules are formed in the SEC, hopefully there's a LSU, Florida, Auburn, whatever it is, the home schedule will be full of marquee games from now on, and that's certainly a big part of the reason that Texas decided to make this move. Not only because they feel like the SEC is the most, the preeminent conference for football, but you improve your home game schedule so you keep your donor base excited and happy, and you're in with schools who bring the thunder. You're not the top 2 revenue earners with 8 schools feeding off of you. And I know that sounds like, oh, how elitist and imperial is that? But even as bad as Texas has been in football since 2009, they still draw the most eyeballs from an audience standpoint. Same with Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma's been winning. They took a step back, obviously, in the first year under Brent Venables. But Texas and OU command more eyeballs. And it'll be interesting to me, Taylor, if as these, dollars keep going up, it may not be this media rights negotiation, but you saw the Big Ten do a 7-year deal. They want shorter term deals because they want to be able to renegotiate. I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see the networks guarantee a flat number for schools and then add an incentive pool for those schools who command the bigger share of the audience, resulting in a bigger share of revenue from, say, a pot of incentive-based money. And because the way it's going right now, you got Vanderbilt really making as much money as Alabama. I mean, I get it, but you can still have everyone making the same base and then have the incentive pot on top of that. I've heard industry sources talking about that, and I think that's something that we could be looking at going forward. And I do think that the Pac-12, this is going to be interesting. They may end up with more games on a streaming network like Amazon or Apple than they have games on regular broadcast television. And that would be a first as well. But I think that's where the most money is for the Pac-12. And that's a big sea change in terms of, how we consume our live sports. But Amazon had good success with the NFL on Thursday night. You're seeing, Google, YouTube, buying up the rights to MLS, and And so we may be in the dawning of a new age in terms of the streaming giants finally getting in and being real players when it comes to college athletics.
Yeah. And I like the idea, honestly, though, when you're talking about the revenue split from the distribution of the, teams in the conference. I mean, it's kind of like how college coaches contracts are written. It's like they have their base salary that they are guaranteed to make. And then if they make it to a bowl game, they get a bonus. If they win a bowl game, they get a bonus. If they go to a conference championship, a lot of times they get a bonus. I mean, you would think that makes a lot of sense, just from um so you don't end up like a Texas and OU being kind of the top two, the tier of the Big 12, and then the rest just kind of, you know, I don't want to say it's probably a bad term, but kind of like riding their coattails a little bit, when it comes to the money and the revenue. So that would make sense. When we talk about revenue, though, and Texas having obviously a better conference home schedule, what does that mean about season ticket holders and or ticket prices in general for Texas home games in the future, do you think?
Well, they've done a pretty good job of holding those prices, in part because the product hasn't been good enough to raise them. But if Steve Sarkisian keeps recruiting the way he's been recruiting, and the recruiting starts to translate to appearances in conference championship games or conference championships, then you might see that dollar go up. Um, we'll see, but I'm not. That's just economics, right?
Right.
Just the law of supply and demand. But um, yeah, season ticket holders at Texas have had it pretty good. They had that Steve Patterson guy show up and kind of change everything on them. But Chris Del Conte has done a pretty good job of holding the football season tickets at a reasonable price, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
if we can say reasonable,
Right, exactly. When you have to give a donation of
when
like
you have to give a donation to
$20,000.
get the right to get the tickets you want.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. All right. Well, there you have it. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. For Chip Brown, I am Taylor Estes. Keep it locked at horns247.com for all the latest Texas scoop.